Hi, I'm Lane Malone, and this video is about scope and depth in video games. This video aims to address why some games seem to perform well and accomplish their goal, while others seem to be stilted and clumsy. When it comes to making a video game, the goal of the developer should be to deliver the intended experience as efficiently as possible. The core mechanic of a video game is the task or action that is repeated in successive variation that acts as the primary vehicle for delivering the core experience. The scope of the game is how much the game tries to accomplish with its core mechanic, and depth is how much variation and complexity the core mechanic is capable of supporting. In this video, I'm going to look at the following video games. I'll discuss teamwork as a core mechanic in Overwatch and Rocket League, strategy as a core mechanic in XCOM 2 and Ruse, and shooting as a core mechanic in Risk of Rain and Call of Duty. I chose these games because they are good examples of games that support their core mechanic well. While there definitely is value in learning from the mistakes of poorly made games, I did not include any games that I dislike in this case study because I wanted to focus on the positives. Also, I typically don't buy any games I know I won't like, so it's hard to get footage of them. Now, I like to talk mad smack against Call of Duty, I admit this, but I'm going to explain why I can still enjoy it, so just hear me out. Now, before I jump into the deep end, I want to talk about how games establish a core mechanic and what kind of actions can be considered core mechanics. The most common ones are the names of the different genres: shooting, racing, role-playing, strategy, and so on. These are general sets of actions that represent the genre, and each game within the genre has its own take on those mechanics. For games to be memorable, they need to step away from the genre by twisting the typical gameplay pattern in unique ways. In any medium, genre writing is something that I think is difficult to do because a genre by definition is a vague set of similarities between things. So the stories or games that are created with the goal of being a cool blank tend to be narratively inconsistent and mechanically stilted. This has to do with two major things. The first is thematic consistency, which I will talk about in a minute, and the next is scope, which I will talk about now. Scope is how much the game tries to accomplish with its core mechanic. I also think of it as measuring the developer's ambition for the game. During the pre-production planning phase, the creative developers are defining what the game is about, which means they are laying out the work for the programmers. This is a critical step in creating a successful video game because having a poor concept of scope can cause problems later in development. I see this happening when creative teams who are usually under pressure from their publishers try to make games cover too much ground in a mechanical sense, leaving the core mechanic underdeveloped. The most common example of this in the market right now is games that include a crafting system that really have no business including a crafting system. Looking at you, Assassin's Creed. This type of feature stuffing that publishers mandate makes the overall performance of the game suffer because it forces time and resources to be diverted away from the core mechanic to extraneous systems that can actually harm the overall experience. You also see this all the time in Hollywood, where big budget movies try to cram romantic subplots into the story that don't really pertain to the overall goal of the movie. This is just poorly defined scope. The movie becomes overambitious and tries to comment on too many different topics or tries too hard to be profound, and the main point gets lost or underdeveloped. This is why John Wick and Judge Dredd were such good action movies. They really only aspired to be action movies. There's no romantic subplot, no weak attempts to comment on social issues, nothing extraneous to our protagonists annihilating bad guys. Games or movies like this are perceived as being very smart because in the age of fatal overproduction, the absence of typical Hollywood tropes is noticeable, which gives the movie a sense of self-awareness without ever breaking the fourth wall. Superhot is a game that took this concept and ran with it. Everything from modern shooters is stripped away so the player can focus on the core mechanic. Another really important aspect of establishing a core mechanic is the game feel, or the perceived kinetic sensation of the game's responses to player input. Game feel is important because the core mechanic of a game has to feel good, otherwise the player has no motivation to repeat it over and over throughout the rest of the game. Game feel is a crucial step in developing a core mechanic. There's that famous story of how Shigeru Miyamoto tested and refined Mario's jump for months before working on any other part of the game. There's not much to say about game feel besides make your game feel good. Once the core mechanic has been created, the devs need to support it throughout the rest of development. The first way this is done is through the environment. I talked a lot about how environments shape the tone and provide interactivity in previous videos, so I won't belabor this one. I want to clarify and say that the interactivity an environment provides should always be centered on the game's core mechanic. What good would Mario's jump be if he didn't have anything to jump on? With the environment wrapped around the core mechanic, the player still faces the issue of getting bored of doing the same thing over and over. This is where variation and depth comes into play. Variation means taking the formula or pattern established by the core mechanic and creating a new pattern by twisting the old one or changing the context of it. Depth is created when those new and old patterns stack on top of each other and allow the player to think about the game on different levels. A common example of this would be a first-person shooter with PvP multiplayer, where the player has to move and shoot, but also consider how his team is functioning together. The next point I'll touch on for supporting the core mechanic is thematic consistency. This is most closely related to scope, but I included it in this section because it is an ongoing concern throughout development. Thematic consistency is self-explanatory. It means keeping all of the elements of the game consistent with the theme. It is important to do because it has to do with the audience perception of the fourth wall. In fiction, any world that is established must be bound together by rules for us to make any sense of it, and the theme of the story will determine the rules that bind the world together. Thematic consistency is about making sure the rules or patterns of the world pertain to the overall theme and don't change throughout the story. The theme is built on the tone of the game, and the tone is built on the environment, and the environment is built on the core mechanic. It's like an onion. An easily overlooked area in games that often struggles with poor thematic consistency is dialogue and character development. All right, let's hop into these case studies. The first two games I want to look at are Overwatch and Rocket League. These are two of my most played games and easily my two favorites. Overwatch specifically took me by storm. Overwatch is an asymmetrical FPS, and Rocket League is a physics-based esports game. I chose to compare them because I argue that both games share the same core mechanic: teamwork. The base components of the two games are different. Overwatch has you shooting and running, and Rocket League has you driving and jumping. These are apparent core mechanics, but what really sets these games above the rest is the level of teamwork that is required to get the full experience. Their game feel is very similar. Both are very colorful and competitive. Each hero in Overwatch has different movement speeds and levels of agility, and all of the cars in Rocket League have the same basic speed and jump, but there are differences in hitboxes and turning radiuses. The games feel fast and intense, but the tone is almost cartoony in that neither game makes any attempt to feel gritty or realistic. It knows what it is, and it sticks to it. The scope of Overwatch and Rocket League are also similar. They are competitive multiplayer games with no story or single player besides practice modes. Both games know what they're trying to accomplish and focus on that goal. Rocket League is the simpler of the two because there are no characters to develop. Everyone who plays the game appears as their own toxic self. Overwatch has 25 unique characters to develop, but they do this in fantastic ways. The character backstories are established outside of the game through the form of comics and digital shorts. In-game, these personalities are present, as each hero has unique dialogue and poses, and the different characters will even exchange words during wait times. This type of character development is subtle and delightful. It respects the core mechanic by not interfering with gameplay at all. Both games offer high levels of depth and variation. Multiplayer games always excel at providing variation because you can never predict what other players are going to do. Every game of Rocket League plays out differently thanks to its robust physics system. The team strategy of Rocket League is also very in-depth and gives the players a whole new level of skill and strategy. Overwatch offers endless variation because of the amount of unique heroes and how they create unique team compositions. I did the combinatorics of how many team compositions are available, and with 25 heroes, it's currently at 177,100 team comps. Times that by 2 when you consider the enemy team. Team composition is such a huge level of strategy in Overwatch that if your team has poor composition, meaning it is unbalanced with too many heroes of the same type, you'll almost certainly lose against any team that works together. Both games also hold professional global championships. I could talk about Overwatch for days, so let's just move on. The next games I want to talk about are XCOM 2 and Ruse. Both are top-down strategy games, but XCOM is tactics and turn-based, and Ruse is base building in real time. Because of this, they have very different game feels. XCOM is gritty sci-fi that seems to go quickly, even though most of the game is staring at your pieces and trying to make the best decision. The combat rounds are actually modeled heavily after D&D. Ruse is real-time, but with huge maps and slow-moving units, so the game takes its time to develop. It also feels simplified and a little gamey, but is still very fun and occasionally brutal. The scope of the two games are fairly different as well. XCOM has a very strong linear narrative, and Ruse has a similar campaign mode. XCOM, however, is rife with introspective dialogue and high sci-fi rhetoric. It's incredibly detailed and has a very grand plot arc. Ruse's core concept is you are the commander, and you look down at your pieces from a strategy map in some command center. The story is historical fiction and focuses on small, pivotal moments in World War II. Both games are very thematically consistent and execute their core mechanic well. In XCOM, there are many customization options for each soldier in your roster, and there are several different classes of soldier. This means that you can experiment with team composition and attack strategy. XCOM also offers many different types of missions to add variety to gameplay. What gives XCOM its strong variety is that each soldier ranks up and persists from mission to mission, so the player often connects with their squad and forms favorites. This makes the game brutal and tragic when a favorite soldier is killed. Ruse offers variation between several maps and different nations, all who have different units and different strengths. Ruse can be played with friends, and the game even allows you to select the behavior profile of AI enemies. The strategy in these games is fun and makes for memorable experiences. The last two games I want to compare are the indie-developed Risk of Rain and Activision's Call of Duty. Risk of Rain is a roguelike platformer, where COD is a traditional FPS. I compare these two because they both feature the same core mechanic, shooting. They have very different game feel. Risk of Rain is colorful and pixelated, where COD is drab and realistic. Both games are very fast-paced and explosive. Call of Duty is the ultimate gun fantasy, and it makes shooting the guns feel really good, which is the whole core mechanic. COD excels at making everything feel good. Risk of Rain is also one of the most kinetically satisfying games I've ever played, and the music is awesome. All of its components fit together flawlessly. It excels at thematic consistency, and the scope is very well conceived. The scope of Call of Duty, however, is troublesome. Scope is the main reason I rag on COD, because it's always overdramatic, uninventive, and full of canned dialogue and gimmicky hooks. It's classic Hollywood pandering, and the successive iterations have only got worse. I stopped buying Call of Duty games after Ghosts. Both games are kinetically driven experiences, so there isn't a lot of depth of strategy, but the games do provide lots of variation. Call of Duty has a bunch of guns and maps to choose from, but the enemies are practically all the same. It does have a large multiplayer, which adds a lot of gated equipment unlocks and PvP challenge. Risk of Rain features many playable classes and procedurally generates levels, but most of them follow the same basic shape. Lots of player upgrades can be found in chests throughout the levels. These upgrades are random, which makes each player build unique. These games, issues aside, execute their core mechanic well. In conclusion, conceiving and supporting a good core mechanic is the basis for which every other game is developed. A game's scope should aim to accomplish only the things that the core mechanic is capable of accomplishing. And to keep players interested, the core mechanic needs to be flexible enough to provide variation, and is even better if those variations create layered strategies. There's a ton of unique games out there that develop their core mechanic in innovative ways, but I gotta stick to the games that I know. My next video will be the last of this series, so the topic is a surprise. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.